Another episode with Dan and George talking about genes and genetics today. Um, we are on to chapter 7
Genes
of
and culture.
yeah, that's right. And let me preface the conversation by saying this is a hefty chapter. I almost wish we could spend a couple episodes on it. Um, I really think that there's a pivot or a turning point in a book that really makes the book. And this chapter does that for me. And in light of the way George and I actually conversate. So what I mean by that is that we're looking at genes and culture. And so I think on the Daniel side of the equation, or how I'm actually reading this text and how I predominantly read texts, I do it through a lens of my own epistemology, worldview, and it's slightly different than George's. So fundamentally, George has been, from the beginning of this podcast series, advocating for the union of science and faith, I believe, right? As far as I can determine.
Yeah, that's the big picture. The more narrow picture is to look closely at what is factual empirical science and what is more speculative, more advocacy, and more driven by a particular kind of faith or worldview that isn't necessarily supported by the facts. You know, we all have that tendency. We've got a way of thinking about things, and we can see things in a certain way, and we have our biases. So I think that's something that we need to be aware of, and I think E.O. Wilson is a brilliant scientist and thinker. This chapter, I agree, is one that just has a lot of meat to it, where his grand global concept is really laid out for the consilience of the genes aspect of biology along with the human aspect of culture. He really pulls it together, but at the same time, he still has a fundamental belief in causal efficacy. In other words, A causes B, causes C, causes D, causes E. It gets more complicated as you go up the chain, but it's still a causal definition. And I think one of the things that misses, we've talked about this before, is when you have complex systems, the evolution of dynamic complex systems isn't necessarily causal from A to B to C to D. It's got new things that show up that can't be predicted from an earlier state. So, but in this chapter, in this context, that's really kind of a small complaint about his overall thrust of bringing together the process of evolution at the biological level and the process of evolution at a cultural level. And I think it's beautifully done.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, let me give you one other analogy of how I characterize George here, because I think it's important, and then I want to respond to what you said. It was very insightful. I see you as a very focused intellect, right? When it comes to this Christian apologetic, right? This compatibility with our society. And if I was imagining a sect of special forces from the Catholic tradition, I would say there's a group of spiral inquirers. How do I make that right? Like spiralers or whatever, right? SIs.
Well,
Right?
there is a thing called spiral philosophy, which I'm not an adherent to, and I don't know very much about, but I keep getting Google hits to
Oh, you do.
spiral inquiry about spiral philosophy. So I have to look into that a little bit more. And for me, spirals is an excellent metaphor for both what happens in the physical world and what happens in the interior world of the human, and then our connections with each other on the grand scale, which is what I call religion or spirituality. So it's really not so different from what a lot of people feel. And although I come from a Christian tradition, I do not consider myself a Christian apologetic. That's a role that, others will play, and some great philosophers have been in that book. St. Thomas Aquinas is a great example of someone who was, at the foundations of natural philosophy, fully steeped in a Christian tradition. As a matter of fact, most of the early scientists were deeply religious people, Descartes included.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
times are different today, and people look at things with a different lens. So
yeah. Duly noted. So I think there's a dimension of George is of your thinking and your advocacy. Thank you for the apologetic clarification. That does help. But there's I think a real strong advocacy on the science side of things, right? You're very proud of the fact that you actually know quite a bit about science and have some mathematical training and background, and so well, you're a pretty smart guy. So you obviously value the all the good things that the our intellectual tradition has bestowed upon us, right?
yeah, and I think it's a math the well, there's a lot of interesting and not necessarily uh, explainable ways that math and science and the world around us and our own consciousness all hold together. I tend to see more mystery at the big picture than many practicing scientists do. But then again, you can find plenty of scientists that, around the edges, they get pretty mystical as well. So,
Yeah.
so I don't think there's uh, I don't think there needs to be an antagonism, but I think there needs to be, an openness and open minds, and that's a good thing to be aware of. I'm sorry, I'm a little distracted here because one of nature's little creatures has found its way to my arm, so I had to approach it.
Really? Was
Yeah,
it
it
a
was a tick.
bird?
No, it was a tick.
Oh, a tick.
So
Oh,
anyway, I'm
what
I'm
a
good.
gentle man! You still saved his life. You let him go
No,
off
I didn't.
to.
No, I didn't.
Oh, you didn't. Oh,
No,
okay,
I didn't.
massacre.
No,
Okay,
no.
children shouldn't be watching the horror here that's happening. We're destroying Mother Nature's fine
Yep,
creatures.
yep, yep.
George.
So I do. I mean, I love science and I love math, and I think part, perhaps part of my background is that in my late teens, early 20s, I was a pretty firm believer in a positivist concept where the foundations of logic and math and empirical science ultimately had all of the answers. And as I followed that trail, I found some very unsettling areas where, in logic, for example, Gödel's incompleteness theorem basically rules out the possibility of knowing all truth, just flat out rules it out. And that was very unsettling. And it gave me the opportunity, I think, to kind of open the perspective a little bit and begin looking at the edges of places where things from a mathematical or a scientific standpoint aren't kind of fitting together and don't necessarily make sense, and those edges define what I characterize as a frontier, the empirical frontier, and to gain some perspective, understanding, appreciation for things that are outside or beyond that frontier, you have to go to the metaphysical or the spiritual to start making sense of it. So I kind of feel that, to really understand the human experience and human life and creation, all the rest of the stuff, you have to go beyond the empirical framework to another way of trying to appreciate things. So that's why, yeah, I will, I'll point out where, E.O. Wilson gets a little dogmatic about even though he's got a background his background was evangelical Christian. He comes on very strongly with a bias when it comes to judging all religions in a particular way. But that's not to discount his amazing intellect,
Yeah.
his great scientific accomplishments, and his drive, his absolute passion for the idea that, it can all come together. We can have a consilience, and all of this stuff can jump together, and that is a wonderful inspiration, and something that we can all really appreciate, even if some of the fine details we might disagree with.
Well, this is the whole idea, I think, of the frame of mind and the faith that you have to, as a non-believer, have to. I think there's some wisdom from our theologies that submitting to that overall good, right? You and I can have that conversation and say, hey, you know what? We don't know what the outcome of E.O. Wilson's ideas are, right? He didn't lay them down like they were dogma. He left them variable in a way. So it's, it gives us, he's pointing us in the direction. He's not giving us a roadmap. And
Yeah,
I
he
think there's a
admits.
difference.
Right, yeah, he's admitting that he's speculating. In this chapter in
Yeah.
particular, he's taking
Yeah.
some leaps and speculating, and and I think that kind of creative inspiration of going outside the boundaries of his actual entomological expertise. He deserves some credit for doing that, because it's a risky thing for a scientist to do, to step outside the bounds of their discipline and their area of knowledge. And E.O. Wilson took some licks for that too. He took some criticism for that. I think there's an interesting book by Lee Smolin called "The Trouble with Physics." It's an interesting little paperback book, and Lee Smolin is another one of those individuals who is able to get comfortable with speculation and talking kind of against the conventions of his own profession. And he points out that it's a risky thing to do. So for young, aspiring PhD candidates and students, in these various disciplines, they kind of have to toe a very narrow line in terms of what they're following. Otherwise they're just not going to get accepted into programs and not going to be able to mentor with people, and so we'll end up in a bit of a backwater. But once you become fully established, then you are given freedom to speculate, and you're given, the tendency to move to the mean, move to the conventional point of view, no longer applies so strongly to those individuals. So you find a lot of people who are, have been accepted in their profession, top of the heap, and they begin to speculate and talk about things that aren't necessarily in their field, and sometimes they take some criticism. Sometimes it turns out to be a goofball effort, and sometimes it yields valuable ways of looking at things. And it's where you are dealing with things that potentially are outside the frontier, as I call it, of mathematical and empirical knowledge. You're really dealing with things in metaphysics.
Right. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And it's almost taboo to have that conversation, anything metaphysical. And yet, I think behind the scenes, it happens all the time. So, anyways,
Yep.
I was messing with my camera here.
Pardon for the noise here. There we go. You're messing with your camera, and I'm messing with my phone. So there we go.
So anyways, so we got the camera's not working. Oh, there we go. So we got the whole book up on screen now, and I just have to remark, actually, I had a couple thoughts as I was putting it on. I thought, well, of course we don't want to scroll through the whole chapter, right? Because this is obviously a copyright thing, but it's pretty big. It shows up on the screen, like I can maximize it like this, and it's very, whoops, it's very readable.
Yeah. Yeah, and
You know,
there's a great paragraph. At the present time, no one has a solution, but in the sense that no
well,
one, well, so he's admitting that some of what he's trying to achieve hasn't been solved yet, and I think that's great.
well, and if you may, I wanted to actually, well, let's put it large, but I wanted to read his definition of culture. And actually, I was happy when I saw it because I was writing something about culture and my own derivative definition, working out something. And I was thinking, where did I read a very good definition of culture? And there's one here that's quite interesting, and I wanted to read it. So it's at the top right hand, right up at the top right. Um, so it says, culture is created by the communal mind, and each mind in turn is the product of the genetically structured human brain. Genes and culture are therefore inseparably linked, but the linkage is flexible, to a degree still mostly unmeasured. The linkage is also tortuous. Genes prescribe epigenetic rules, which are the neural pathways and regularities in cognitive development by which the individual mind assembles itself. The mind grows from birth to death by absorbing parts of the existing culture available to it, with selections guided through epigenetic rules inherited by the individual brain. Quite a quite a neural picture there.
Yeah, and like any attempt to describe a very, very complicated process, he has to take some make some simplifications, and I think the genetic and epigenetic process, which he goes into in some length in this chapter, is kind of it's shorthand for his way of perceiving it. And then, culture is also a shorthand. I think the point is it is a tortuously complicated set of linkages, and the relationships among the various levels in that process, from the raw genetics to the epigenetics, to the way the epigenetics deals with the environment as it, that's all an incredibly complicated process. And I think, again, this shows part of what he's trying to do is move with a causal brush from from genes. It starts with nature nurture, that argument, and which he rightly points out is just misplaced, because they both play an incredibly important role in the process. But you have genes, and then you have the environment, and you have the genes are a lot more complicated in the way they interface than people have normally understood. You may remember back when they were first looking at the human genome, and some of the experts said, well, we really, the genes that we find are really only small pieces of the entire genome, and really 90% of the human genome is just junk DNA. It really doesn't do anything because the genes are over here. Well, that, 20, 30 years later was completely overturned because of the role that even those the things that are not specifically identified as genes play critical roles in terms of turning genes on, shutting genes off, and that's what the epigenetic side of it is. So there's a tendency, by using what we know and the language we know and the processes we know, we end up leaving out some very important things. But I'm not going to argue with this definition. I think it's a pretty good definition. Although, like everything else, it's a lot more complicated than it sounds.
Agreed. Yeah, yeah. Well, I know for one of my planksip videos, I used this Berlin and Kay study that he quotes towards the end of the chapter. It's a big chapter. It's really, really
It is.
big.
It is.
Are you okay to do chapter 8 again next week as well?
Well, this is chapter 7, right? So we can do
that's
yeah,
what I mean. Chapter 7.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, chapter
Yeah.
7. Yeah, there's plenty here, plenty of different ways to tackle this material. So are you finding
Yeah.
that one section you're referring to?
Well, it's about the color. It's about the
Color
uh,
vocabulary?
color vocabulary. Berlin and K. No, I think Berlin and K was the subtle how it changes from one color to the next, and the transition, the flick in the brain, like the instant. We know it's gradation,
Yeah,
right? But
yeah, yeah.
there's
But there are points, right? There are points when the definition in a given culture will switch from green to blue-green to blue if they have that split, and it seems to happen at particular points in the spectrum, even though we know it's a continuum of spectrum, right?
Yeah, and so that's a really interesting observation, and that's the kind of insight that science can give. But I understand it's not the complete picture, and there's part of the way I envision a complex system that maybe for us to get the most holistic view, that bringing pieces in that are scientific um, uh, may not complete the best picture. You know what I mean?
Uh,
Because there's like an
Explain that a
unfolding of
little bit more.
sorts.
Yeah. There's a
Yeah,
what?
there's an unfolding of sorts based off of what we invent, what we discover. How technology is now shaping us in many respects, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And ideas shape ideas. So this is an example
That's
where
right.
we now know that color is a spectrum, a continuum, and we also know that the human eyeball is capable of distinguishing, I think, something like 6 million shades of color, and yet we have to parse that six. Obviously you can't have 6 million words for color, so you have to parse it down and categorize it, and from an evolutionary standpoint, your brain is going to want a simple, efficient, effective set of categorization that is most useful to survival.
Yeah.
So cultures will then shape their vocabulary and their way of the way of describing something based upon what categorization is most useful for them. And so I think that's a good example of the way the cultural elements facing natural selection in the environment that culture is living is going to shape the language that they use, because they're going to use the simplest, most efficient, most effective linguistic way of describing color that's most useful to them. So it may not include, it may have quite a few. It may have less colors than another culture where, as for example, artistic expression becomes a valuable part of it, and ornamentation becomes valuable. Then you're going to be looking at more discrete levels of color, and you're going to have more words for color. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, George. I mean, I want to give you an example with a website. Okay, so the language of a web programmer is going to use the word ontology, which is very familiar to us in a philosophical sense, right? It's the most substantive form of metaphysics, right? It's the kind of the framework, right? So, or defined as, in many cases, it's what's defined as being, right? Bringing into existence. But the idea here of the word ontology used from a computer science standpoint is it's entirely like an algorithm. Okay, so we go back, to Aristotle. It'd be like basing our entire um, knowledge system on a system that was all Aristotelian syllogisms, right? We would
Right.
be really like weird robots in a way, right? Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so, yeah, but the technology is going there, right? We have the tech, but you don't write algorithms in like a series of paradoxes, right? You get thinking, suspending thought, creative. I want to put a module of creativity in there, right? And possibly there is a way to do it. oddly enough, I'm actually simultaneously doing a project or research on creativity and going back to one of E.O. Wilson's other books on creativity. It's interesting. He's a pretty good resource for that too.
Yeah, and it's the other thing to realize is, well, technology is interesting, but we narrow our understanding uh, with our cultural context and our vocabulary.
Yeah,
So that's one of the reasons why, uh, and we do it for legitimate evolutionary reasons. Is there a reason to have that many words, or how you characterize? So you may have reasons built into your particular use of vocabulary, your way of seeing things, based upon the cultural past and the historical past. Um, and you can be quite blind as a result to things that are inconsistent with that vocabulary and with the ways of characterizing the cultural forms. And so one of the interesting exercises, and I think this is becoming a more commonly talked about process, particularly in technology, is cognitive bias, and where that enters into the equation and what it looks like. And one of the egregious examples is in artificial intelligence, deep learning systems that will absorb a lot of data and spit out results. And facial recognition is one of the common examples. And they find that, yeah, the algorithm is very good at processing through billions and billions and billions of bits of information, but it's also subject to significant biases. Sometimes the biases are in the data, and if you're not aware of those biases, one of the examples is in psychology, where so many of the psychological studies in the 20th century were done using American college students. Well,
mm,
American college
yeah,
students are culturally quite biased, and as they tried to replicate some of those results in other cultures, they couldn't get replication. So that's an example of the way bias rolls into culture. uh, Culture rolls into data, data rolls into analysis, and you end up with a so-called neutral algorithm in AI that is really quite biased, and negatively so for significant portions of the population. So, and I think historically, language has had the same process for narrowing, categorizing, limiting, and it's all useful to to categorize and limit and become efficient in how you express yourself and how you think about the world. But it's also limiting, and it makes it easy to just sort of skip over certain things that are proved to be quite significant.
yeah. So George, I have it's not really a favor. This is kind of like you can take it or leave it kind of thing. But I've been working on a project called the passive filter. And what the passive filter does is it scrapes information from a Google search page, and we've done this with at planksip, right? We've done this more of the research that I was working on for a literary analysis tool, in fact,
Hmm.
and a cultural measure. Okay, at
Hmm.
least as it relates to famous intellectuals of our past, because at planksip
Yeah,
we study that a
yeah,
lot, right?
yeah.
So what the passive filter does is it takes a list of thinkers. It could be people all the way from like Newton to Bacon to um, Mother Teresa. There's lots of people in there, that we sample. Now, what happens is that if you notice that the the amount of literature or the searches and that relational database, if it shows things are changing, this is a reflection on how much people. This is the search habits of people related to those famous intellectuals. So at Planksip, we use it as a part of our content creation strategy, right? If we notice that, I'll give you an example. In psychology, the most, I guess, underlooked psychologist, who is termed the father of psychology, is Wilhelm Wundt. right? He was the out of the three, which was um, Sigmund Freud and Jung, right? Who typically get talked about in psychology as kind of like the founding members, of the club. Anyway, so Wilhelm Wundt does not get as much. He's not talked about as much, and so I try and write about him, semi periodically, right? Because I think he's like underrepresented, right? It's like, sure, this sex sells, as they say in media, right? So
Yeah.
who gets to ride on those coattails, right?
Yeah. Freud.
We already know that. And the Jordan Peterson revival of the subconscious controls more than we think it does club is, right up with Jung, right? So that's a whole other thing. But Wilhelm Wundt was, he put empiricism into psychology, right? Showing these biases, like how weight can be subjective in terms of how our measuring apparatus actually feels weight. And then there's the fascinating one about, like, I'm such an advocate with the Damasio line of pleasure, pain, and felt experience and all this kind of thing. But the way we process it is very subjective as well, right? So it's like in a hospital, you go to patient 1, patient 2, patient 3, and you all ask them where their pain threshold number is. Is it 0? Is it a 10? Where do you fit? And you'll have like a variety of answers, right? For something that could be very similar pain wise. But so it's a very subjective experience kind of scenario.
Yeah, and also interesting that Damasio talks about the fact that your perception of pain can vary significant because of external factors. So
Yeah. Well, let me ask you, George. So
yeah, go ahead.
I don't think you got the full gist of what I was going to say, but can I send you our research on the path filter? Do you know what I'm talking about now? Like it's a
yeah, love to see that.
Okay, so
yeah, I think that's a good example where well, the other old saying is the squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? Is a common phrase. Well, yeah, it is true that some of the better thinkers don't necessarily get picked up except in a secondary way, So other people will pick up the thoughts, carry them forward, not necessarily giving credit, but they're the ones that get the popularity. The same thing happens with Nobel Prizes. So, yeah, I think part of the thing about human knowledge is that it is not an individual achievement. It is a complex network of great thinkers and great scientists, 99.9% of whom don't get any credit.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, George, I couldn't agree more. And that's, this is the whole foundation of why I tried to create an organization that paid homage to that, really.
Yeah.
That whole process is, I think, undervalued in our society. I mean, imagine that really should be, the mainstay. That's the aspiring ladder to climb, really.
Yeah, and it's one of the things that, again, we categorize, we simplify, but all of science is an interconnected, deeply interconnected, uh, multidisciplinary, millions of great minds, men, women, all races, all backgrounds, millions of human minds collaborating together in an enterprise that is, probably the biggest human enterprise ever, because it is driving the technology and the mastery of stuff that allows humans to be so successful as a species. So, and that enterprise of science is just an amazing and fascinating process. And yeah, humans are kind of interested in novelty, as biological survival characteristics, interest in novelty, knowing what's different, and also a tendency to personalize, or have what do they call it, the culture of notoriety. Individuals just get great recognition, whereas the most people don't. So that's a simplification in terms of the way we look at the scientific process. We see the heroes, and we tend not to see the thousands and thousands and thousands of people that made that heroism possible. And I think the interconnectedness of the whole enterprise is one of the things. It's an amazing positive outgrowth of culture, because it's a culture that has crossed national boundaries, crossed ethnic boundaries, crossed boundaries of time and space in significant ways. And it has in a sense, it is a living creature of its own. And that's one of the things that I think maybe a little bit more broadly about culture than E.O. Wilson does. It's not just simply, a group of human beings, kind of getting together and making some rules. It has its own behaviors. It's a complex system that has its own behaviors, and it does act as if it were an organism in its own right, but at a different level. So, you could look at culture and civilization as something like we have the physical world, we have the biological world, and then we have consciousness occurring, and then we have another level of existence at the institutional, cultural level that has a life of its own. Like, the ant colony has a life of its own, whereas the individual ants participate in it. Well, human culture is something similar. We're participating in the creation of something that we are not going to be able to understand fully, because we're simply a piece of it, a part of it. That's getting a
Yeah,
little difficult.
that's really good. Actually, I really liked your definition of culture, and I wanted to invite you to a project that you're the first to hear about it, George.
Okay.
Yeah, it's an anthology on culture. And so what George just freestyled there for you was really a great definition of culture, right? Like if I wrote it down and then I sent it to you, you could look at it and you could tweak it a little bit, but overall, George, I think it was really good. Just
Well,
like a
thanks.
written
Yeah.
essay.
Yeah. Thanks. I think what's interesting to me is that so culture is like an organism, and a human organism is like a human organism is an organism. The individual cells are like organisms. So you have layers of different layers that have different spheres, and that play according to different sets of rules, and those rules are analogous to the empirical study of chemistry, the empirical study of biology, but it's really complex systems at play that really have different kinds of behaviors than the lower level. So I see it as a multi-level process of trying to understand how all of this fits together. And this is where the causal relationship between A and B, I think, has a lot more complexity to it than many people, including E.O. Wilson, would like to posit, and that is that visualizing the universe as operating from quantum causation to physical causation to chemical causation to biological causation to the generation of higher levels of intelligence creating different kinds of dynamics, feeding to survival, feeding to culture, feeding to civilization, and each one of those levels carries with it unknowns and uncertainties in how that process works through. So it's not a deterministic process of how these layers get added on. It's an evolving process at each level. There's evolution that works at each level. And it does have a cosmic character to it if you can go back to the beginning of the Big Bang and how that cascaded and unfolded and evolved and yielded the physics that we know, and the physics that we know yielded the processes that led to the chemistry that we know. The chemistry enabled the evolution of biology in some way that we only poorly understand, and biology led to the evolution of sentient consciousness, which allows us to look at this whole thing. I just think that's a fascinating idea, that those processes, as they evolved, as they emerged, enabled consciousness at the highest level to then be able to turn around and look at all of this stuff.
Yeah, it's beautiful, isn't it? Right? I
Yeah.
mean, in a way, we become like, unlike any other creature, we become this omniscient viewer of ourselves.
Yeah. But our trajectory ultimately depends on every one of those steps in the process. So we are ultimately dependent upon the existence of bacteria,
right.
and the dependence on carbon,
Yeah.
and the dependence on quantum physics. We're ultimately dependent upon that, because if we didn't have that trajectory, we wouldn't be here.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, you're talking about the the characteristics of the So
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, it's the story. Is it the story, or so you merge the story and the science together all in one and make it
Right.
beautiful? So it's like a re-emergence of the story. And I actually I have a soft heart for that, to think, why can't we use the same mechanisms that are within our love of storytelling and myth making and all this? Why can't we do that with science? Like as popularizers. And where's the line, right? You
Right.
see like a written paper and in an academic journal, and just the slightest twinge of irony might be okay. Might
Mm-hmm.
be, it might get by, but
Mm-hmm.
don't take that too far.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
Yeah. Yeah. And
there's no
that's a
smiley
constraint.
faces or like, this kind of
Right.
stuff, right?
Right. That's a constraint in the culture of science
Yeah.
that does not allow reputable scientists to, engage in humor, irony, sarcasm, or speculation, or delving into metaphysics. I mean, those are all no-nos, and it will get you booted out of the culture of science unless you're well established, like E.O. Wilson, or or some of the other greats. Roger Penrose is another fabulous scientist that will speculate. And once he's in the speculation, then a bunch of people jump on that and kind of poo-poo that. And so it's an interesting, science is an interesting culture. It's both this expansive, amazingly expansive and wonderful culture, but it also has its constraints and its limits.
You know what? I think the function of academia is broken. Okay, now this is just the hypothesis. It's not operating the way it should be, because I advocate for more rhetoric to do exactly what you're talking about. So the Penrose idea of throwing something out for controversy, let's just look at the way we are as a society. We don't send stuff out and put it on social media and talk about it and take people's attention away from, popping bubbles or playing their favorite little arcade thing or whatever they're doing, right? It's like, by the way,
Yep.
we've got something important, and let's do it with something you already know. Well, we got to put some controversy out there if you're going to be a thought leader. We got to put these ideas out, and because how else do people react? They don't.
Well,
so this is on our onus to actually get them talking.
That's a good point, and that's one of the reasons why I think storytelling and narrative is very, very important. And for those of us that feel, the empirical enterprise, the scientific enterprise is critically important, we need to get better at telling that story, and finding ways to tell that story. And some are particularly good. Who's the guy on Nova that that everybody loves and wishes he was their brother or something? I can't.
Well,
I'm
there's
lousy with names, not coming
I
up
know
with it.
there's Neil deGrasse Tyson, but then
That's
there's
the one.
also yeah.
Yeah, Neil
Oh,
deGrasse was the
you,
one I'm
you
thinking.
know what I
Science,
like
come on,
most about
a great storyteller, and yeah.
yeah,
So that's a terrific advocate for science because it takes it down out of the academia and the sterile, language to a level that people can relate to. And I think that's something that we all we all need to do, not only with science, but with philosophy and mathematics.
yeah.
You know,
I
let's
agree.
find
I
ways to
agree.
let's find ways to make this stuff a little bit more digestible and interesting to people because it's important.
Yeah, without any loss of value. See, the thing is that I take somebody like Tyson and I say I like him because he's able to categorize, put something into a perspective that I haven't, in a way that I haven't thought of before,
Hmm.
right? And has a way of kind of dismantling it a little bit because we realize that we do think in the streams of our culture, right?
Hmm.
And so
Hmm.
what Tyson is really good at is he's got that scientific educational tradition in him, right? And so he really wants you to learn. He really wants to convey that knowledge. And so
Hmm.
I applaud him with it. But he's constantly, his algorithm is always looking for a novel way to show simplicity to this idea.
Right, right, right. And I think that's what it needs. I think philosophy got lost in the academies, some time ago, and stuck arguing about linguistics and logic, and lost touch with you know with the importance of philosophy as as the creation of human wisdom and figuring out how to live a better life, which is the way I think you and I would both agree this is what philosophy is, not this sterile arguments about semantics and not actually providing the kind of substance that people can actually listen to and live and maybe make a part of their lives. So yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I agree.
You have a hard cutoff time of right about now, George. I'm reminding you,
Yeah,
I think a minute late, but
yeah. No, I think this has been a good conversation. So why don't we come at chapter 7 from different angles next week, and we'll then see if we can't pull it all together.
good. All right.
All
Talk to you
right.
next week.
Thank you,
Bye.
Dan.